Hi and welcome to another edition of the Leadership Untitled podcast with me, Rob Moores. This is the show that brings together experts from the fields of leadership, L&D, coaching, HR, you name it, to share hints and tips and just have conversations that will hopefully help you navigate that field of leadership that little bit easier. My guest this week is Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor, as well as being the co-founder of the company of the same name, looking to build more radically candid organisations. Kim has also been CEO, coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter and other tech companies, and she was also a member of the faculty at Apple University, and before that she led AdSense, YouTube and DoubleClick teams at Google. She's also managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. Now, I would say that's quite a lot and it's quite global. This is a fascinating conversation of just how to have clearer and more challenging conversations in the workplace as leaders, as well as introducing her new book, Radical Respect, which really provides the foundation of relationships and trust before we can even get to that challenging position. Please join me in welcoming Kim to the podcast. Hi Kim, thanks for joining the Leadership Untitled podcast today. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Awesome. We've just been comparing weather notes, I think, as is the custom when you meet someone new, between Congleton and California. And no surprise really that you won.
I don't know. I mean, we could use a little more rain here. We would have less risk of wildfire if we were getting a little bit of your rain. So
I would love to be able to do a trade with you.
Yes, yeah.
Just give you a little bit of rain.
Really useful, yeah.
And we've already just been sharing our shared passion of orange, so that's awesome as well. So we've got a lot in common going into this. Brilliant
Absolutely.
Stuff. What I like to do just before we kind of get into the thick of it is I like to say why it is I've reached out, what made me reach out. For in your case, what it was. So I do lots of leadership stuff, lots of coaching. And there's so many kind of models out there, and specifically around things like feedback, that I just think they're just too regimented, too many steps.
Yeah.
Force people to follow them. Exactly that. They're just not flowing. And what I particularly loved, and people if they recognize your name and don't know where from, Radical Candor, most probably, and the new book coming along as well is out now, I believe. Radical Respect. So it's this idea that, that so many people, when you use the words you've got, care personally about somebody and challenge them directly, that to a lot of people is a big mind shift, because so many times in business, I've found that people think, well, if I need to challenge more directly, that means I need to care less personally.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Exactly wrong. Yes.
So that really got me going, and when I saw that the first time, going, you know what, that's absolutely right. If it's possible for you to be bad at both of those things, which it is.
Yes, it is, unfortunately.
It must be possible to be good at both of those things without having to dial on back completely. So that's kind of my first introduction to you. So I'd love to get you on the podcast to talk about this and the challenges for it, and also looking ahead a little bit into the new book, the fact that it's kind of a prequel, really, isn't it? That there's and why that came about. But I guess, to start us off, Kim, how did you get into this world of radical candor and radical respect? What led you to it?
Well, sort of like you, I struggled with feedback a lot. I was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, in the south of the U.S., and being polite, being kind to people is a very important part of the culture in which I was raised. And when I started my career in business, especially when I started a company and I was co-founder and CEO, I found it very difficult to tell people what I needed, what it was my job, in fact, to tell them. And I remember at one point, somebody sent me, actually 10 different people at the company sent me the same article about how people would rather have a boss who is a complete jerk, but really competent, than one who's really nice, but incompetent. And I thought, are they sending me this because they think I'm a jerk or because they think I'm incompetent? And surely those are not my two choices, No. Sort of what you were talking about. We feel like for some reason we have to choose between being competent and being kind. And that is a false choice. We do not have to make that choice. We can be both competent and kind at the same time. And that was really when I started thinking about it. And I was lucky enough to have a lot of great mentors over the course of my career who showed me what this looked like. At one point after I started working at Google, I had become friends with Matt Cutts, who was in charge of search quality at Google. And Matt and I agreed that there was a certain AdSense policy that was hurting search quality. And Larry Page, one of the founders, disagreed with us. And Matt and I went together to talk to Larry about this. And Matt at one point he was so passionate about this. He cared very deeply, not only about Larry, but about search quality, that he kind of started yelling. And he was making his case he was challenging very directly and maybe a little loudly. And Matt's not a loud guy. He's like a very even-keeled person. And I remember at first thinking, oh my gosh, my new friend at work is going to get fired. And then I looked at Larry's face and he was grinning. He was encouraging Matt to really state his case as forcefully as he needed to. And I realized that what was happening there was not rude. It was not mean. It was about a shared passion for the work and a shared commitment to getting along with each other. And I also realized that Larry he wasn't exactly soliciting feedback, but he was sort of with his body language and his expression was encouraging it. And the culture at Google was very much be loud, tell us why we're wrong, great ideas come from everywhere. And so I began to learn that soliciting feedback is the place to start with radical candor. Don't dish it out before you prove you can take it. And that we will do better work and enjoy working together more if we can do that.
And I guess if you're reaching out for it to start with and actually showing then and role modeling the behaviors when you receive that feedback, then that kind of grows the trust, it grows the relationship and makes the other people a little bit more likely to take feedback from you.
Yes, exactly. And also, I think you want to sort of reward the candor when you get it. And not just with a smile, but, change your mind. And say, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong. I'm so glad we had this conversation. And the louder and more theatrically you can do that as a leader, the more people will understand that when you solicit feedback, you really genuinely want it and they're not wasting their breath. You will change your mind. And I think that's a big part of creating a culture of psychological safety. I have been doing some work with Amy Edmondson recently, and we both agree that when leaders get really good at soliciting feedback, that's what they do to create a culture of psychological safety. So there's a few things that leaders can do to solicit radical candor. First of all, they can figure out how they're going to ask for, because if you say, do you have any feedback for me? You're wasting your breath. I can already tell you the answer. Oh no, everything's fine. Nobody who works for you wants to the only people in your life who really genuinely want to give you feedback are your teenage children. If you have those, they really want to. I
have two of those, Kim. Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
It's the house of radical candor here. But at work, people really are reluctant. So you've got to think about very consciously how you're going to ask. So a question that I like to ask is what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? And that there's a few things about a go-to question. One is don't write down my question, because if you sound like Kim Scott and not like yourself, the other person is not going to believe that you really want the answer. I was working with Krista Quarles when she was CEO of OpenTable, and she said, Kim, I could never imagine your words coming out of my mouth. She said, the way I like to ask for feedback is tell me why I'm wrong. Okay, that's fine too. But both of our questions They can't be answered with a yes or a no. So make sure that your question really puts the onus on the other person to say something. And you also may need to change your question depending on who you're talking to. Being an authentic leader does not mean ignoring the impact that you're having on others. So, for example, Jason Rosoff, who I started the company Radical Candor with, told me after we had worked together for about a month, he said, Kim, I kind of hate your go-to question. It's too big. I don't know what you're looking for. I don't want to have to answer that question. Can you narrow it down? So I adjust for Jason. I'm not going to ask him the question that.
Yeah.
And Krista found there were a couple of people on her team who felt her question was too aggressive. It made them kind of shut down. So anyway, think about your go-to question and who you're going to ask it of. So adjust it for yourself, adjust it for the other person. Make sure it can't be answered with a yes or a no. And that's really, if the only thing that people take away from this podcast is they jot down a question for how to solicit feedback, our time today is very well spent. So that's important. Get your go-to question. The bad news about your question is that no matter how good your question is and how thoughtful you've been, the other person is still going to feel uncomfortable. I do not have emotional Novocaine on offer, unfortunately. The only way out is through. So the next step in this is to embrace the discomfort. Close your mouth, count to 6. Only made it to 3 just there. That seemed like a long time.
I tried my best.
I know you did very well, but if I'd gone all the way to 6, you would have been like, is your Wi-Fi frozen? Almost nobody can endure 6 full seconds of silence. So they'll probably tell you something, which brings you to your third step. You want to make sure that you're listening with the intent to understand, not to reply. Because even though you just solicited feedback, you're probably going to feel a little bit defensive when you get it. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you're shut down to feedback. It doesn't mean you're a lesser human. It just means you are human, and your humanity is all part of radical candor. It's all part of this. So don't give yourself too hard a time if you feel defensive, but learn how to manage your own feelings of defensiveness. A simple tactic is to ask some follow-up questions. An example of this came, my daughter, when she was younger, said to me at breakfast one morning, Mom, I wish you weren't the radical candor lady. And immediately I felt defensive. I was like, I'm spending too much time at work, but I have to work, like I owe it to the family, And then I thought, okay, I should take my own advice here. So I asked a follow-up question. I said, well, who do you wish I were? And she said, I wish you were the lady who minded her own business. So I could spend a little more time at work as far as she was. So make sure you understand what the person is really saying to you. Make sure you're genuinely trying to understand this and that you're managing your own you're not judging yourself for feeling defensive, but that you're able to recognize it and re-engage that executive function. Because when you're feeling defensive, you are not listening, and that's no good. And then the fourth step to soliciting feedback successfully is to make sure that you reward the candor when you get it. Because it is not enough to say thank you for the feedback. Instead, if you agree with the feedback, you've got to actually fix the problem. You've got to make a change. And then you need to solicit more feedback. And you need to ask that person, did I go too far? Did I overcorrect or did I undercorrect? Did I not go far enough? Get more feedback. And that makes the person realize that they're not wasting their breath by talking to you, that you'll actually do something if you agree. Now, there are going to be times when you solicit feedback and then you disagree with it. And it's easy to feel wedged in that moment, and it's tempting to pretend to agree or just to say thank you for the feedback. But certainly, I'm not going to advocate pretending to agree when you disagree. That would not be radical candor. And if you just say thank you for the feedback, that feels like a brush off to the person. So when you disagree with the feedback that you've just solicited, you owe it to the person to explain why in a respectful way. But first, before you do that, listen intently to what was said and look for that overlap. There's some 5 or 10% overlap there's something you can agree with in what the person said. And so give voice to that, just to show that you're listening, make your listening tangible, and to demonstrate that you're not automatically shut down to what they're saying. And then you want to have a respectful explanation of why you disagree. Because that is going to help you all get on the same page. I mean, maybe you'll persuade them, maybe they'll persuade you, maybe you'll have to be in a listen, challenge, commit kind of situation, and you'll have to do it their way or they'll have to do it your way. But at least you have heard each other. And then down the road, you can sort of revisit the conversation. And when I talk about listen, challenge, commit, I think there's a risk here that a leader will think that their direct reports have to, in the end, commit to what they do. But I learned something really valuable from a colleague of mine, Russ Laraway, who wrote, by the way, a great book called When They Win, You Win. And with his direct reports, he would say to them, if we have data, let's do what the data says. But if all we have are opinions, let's go with yours. So he would explain his opinion, but then he would defer to his direct reports to the maximum extent possible. And that meant that they knew that he was listening to them, but it also meant that they were going to listen to him and make sure that they agreed with that their opinion wasn't going to get them into trouble. So I think that's a good rule of thumb.
I guess what immediately came to my mind is that I'd probably be spending even more time making sure my ideas were great ones if I knew they were going to be chosen. Because how many times do you go, you know what, I'm not even going to bother spending much time thinking about it. Doesn't listen to me anyway.
Yes. And it also meant that Russ got very good at showing his thought process, explaining why he thought what he thought. So that, because if you show your work, it makes it easier for someone else either to show you the flaw in your logic or to say, oh, now I get it, let's do it. And so it makes it easier to get on the same page. And I think also when there's a power imbalance and you have more power in the relationship, the more you can lay it down, the better to build a real radical candor is about a relationship. And there are a few things that are more damaging to a relationship than a power imbalance. So you want to lay it down when you're the manager.
I mean, what I also love is a shared love of a 2x2. So they're 4-box grids. I love that. But more so than that, I think what I love is the nuance that you talk about in the book, Radical Candor. That, this isn't just 4 segments. There's a lot of movement within those segments. I think at one point you even talked about Google and Apple and how they're in different parts of the radical candor zone because of their cultures. I think that's really important that we recognize the individuality, not just of people, but of teams, of organizations and so on, and address it like that.
Yeah. So for folks who haven't read the book, maybe I should describe the 2x2. You want me to walk through it?
Go for it. Yeah.
So what is radical candor? Radical candor is what happens when you care personally and you challenge directly at the same time. And so if you imagine a vertical line, which is called care personally, and a horizontal line, which is called challenge directly, then you wind up with 4 boxes. Upper right-hand quadrant is radical candor. But sometimes we remember to challenge directly, but we forget to show we care personally. And that's the bottom right-hand quadrant. That's what I call obnoxious aggression. And in fact, in the first version of the book, in the first draft of the book, I called that the asshole quadrant because, I don't know, it seemed more clear. But I stopped doing that for a really important reason. I found that when I did that, people would use this framework to start writing names in boxes. And I beg of you, please don't use this framework that way. This is not another Myers-Briggs personality test. This is a way to make sure that you are guiding specific conversations with specific people to a better place. Now, obnoxious aggression is a big problem. Obnoxious aggression is a problem because it hurts other people, first and foremost. Obnoxious aggression is also a problem for you because it's inefficient. Like if I am a jerk to you, Rob, then you are likely to go into fight or flight mode, and then you literally cannot hear what I'm saying. So I'm wasting my breath. So obnoxious aggression is also a waste of breath. It is also a problem for a more subtle reason, because most people really dread landing here. Most people really do not want to be jerks. And so at least for me, and I'd be curious to see if this is your experience as well, but when I land, when I find that someone thinks I've been a jerk, it's not my instinct to go the right direction on care personally. Instead, it's my instinct to go the wrong way on challenge directly. And to pretend like I don't, I think something that I don't actually think, to pretend to agree when in fact I disagree. And that lands me in the worst place of all, in the bottom left-hand quadrant, manipulative insincerity. That's what I'm doing when I neither care nor challenge. And it's kind of fun to tell stories about obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity, because that's where the drama is. When we talk about things going wrong at work, we're often talking about these behaviors. And yet most of us don't make our mistakes in those quadrants. The vast majority of people make the vast majority of mistakes in this last quadrant, where we do remember to show that we care personally, because you know what? Most people are actually pretty nice people. But we're so worried about not hurting someone's feelings or not offending them that we fail to tell them something that they'd be better off knowing in the long run. And this is what I call ruinous empathy. And that's really the mistake that I'm trying to address in Radical Candor. I mean, all of the mistakes I'm trying to address, but since that's the most common one, I focus on the problems of ruinous empathy.
It is, and so many people relate to it when I walk through it with them. It's unbelievable to a degree. But in the book you talk about, and I use this example because I think it's so clear, and it was your intent for it to be clear. Saying, if I just walked into the training room now and my flies are undone, what would you do? And I just love that example, because people genuinely do go, "Oh my God, I wouldn't know what to do." I'd hope someone else would say something. They get flustered even with that question. And you go straight away, ruinous empathy, because now you've just seen me walk out at lunch and another 200 people have seen me with my flies down.
Yeah, exactly. It's much worse. And yet it's kind of awkward to tell someone their fly is down, isn't it? Or spinach in their teeth. And it's even more awkward with more, with other issues that are maybe, more core to the work.
So with all the work you've done on this and all the companies and people you've worked with, what tends to be the biggest challenge or challenges to getting towards that radical candor zone for people then?
I think it is ruinous empathy is a deeply ingrained bad habit for most of us, and changing habits is really hard. And I joke, it's fast, it's free, it just takes enormous emotional discipline, and that's pretty hard to change. So on the one hand, I say it should be easy. It's these impromptu 2-minute conversations that we should be having with folks multiple times a day. And that is a real, that's hard. These impromptu 2-minute conversations. It sounds so simple and easy. And on the one hand, it is in theory simple and easy, but it is something. I was teaching at a business school class, and one of the students said, "For me, feedback is a source of existential dread." Either getting it or giving it. And so I think it's important to learn how to take specific steps to changing behavior. One of the things that I find most helpful for me and also for the people I work with is to tell a story about ruinous empathy and give it a name. So for me, I have this Bob story. And it's about a time when I was ruinously empathetic, just trying to be nice, and the results were not so nice after all. And I'm sure that you have a story like this, and I bet every single person listening to this podcast can think of 5 or 6 similar stories. So I'll tell you my story. As I'm telling you my story, think about your story and give it a name. And then next time you're in a situation where you should say something, but you're tempted to default to silence, think of this story And that will help you actually move in the right direction, move from ruinous empathy towards radical candor. This happened pretty early in my career. I had just hired this guy, we'll call him Bob. And I liked Bob a lot. He was smart, he was charming, he was funny. He would do stuff like he was at one of those manager offsites, and everybody was stressed out. It was a startup. We were playing one of those endless get to know you games. And Bob was the guy who had the courage to raise his hand and to say, I can tell everybody's stressed out. I've got an idea. It'll help us get to know each other, and it'll be really fast. Whatever his idea was, if it was fast, we were down with it. And Bob said, let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. I don't know if they do that in the UK, but in the US, parents bribe their children with candy to get them to poop in the right place.
Yeah, however we train a dog, we train the kids the same way. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So weirder, kind of a weird idea, but weirder yet. Everyone remembered Hershey Kisses right here. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would pull just the right piece of candy for the right person out of his bag and give it to them. And so Bob was kind of quirky. He was funny, though. He brought some levity to the office. Everybody loved working with Bob. There was one problem with Bob. He was doing terrible work, absolutely terrible work. I was so puzzled because he had this great resume, this great history of accomplishments. I learned much later that the problem was that Bob was smoking pot 3 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy that he had all the time. But I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew is that he was handing work in to me with shame in his eyes. And I would say to him some version of, oh, Bob, you're so smart. You're so awesome. Everybody loves working with you. Maybe you could make it just a little bit better, which of course he never did. So let's pause for a moment. Why did I say something so useless to Bob? Part of it was truly ruinous empathy. I really did like Bob, and I really did not want to hurt his feelings. But if I'm honest with myself, there was also something more insidious going on, because Bob was popular, and Bob was also sensitive. And there was part of me that was afraid that if I told Bob in no uncertain terms that his work wasn't nearly good enough, that he would get upset and he would start to cry. And then everybody would think I was a big you-know-what. So the part of me that was worried about my reputation as a leader, that was the manipulative insincerity part. And the part of me that was worried about Bob's feelings, that was the ruinous empathy part. And those two things often go hand in hand. You know, there's, as you said before, we kind of merge between the quadrants sometimes in one conversation. Anyway, this went on for about 10 months, and eventually the inevitable happened. And I realized that if I didn't fire Bob, I was going to lose all my best performers, because not only had I been unfair to Bob not to tell him, I'd been unfair to the whole team, because now everyone was frustrated because their deliverables were late when Bob's deliverables were late. They weren't able to spend as much time as they needed to on their work because they had to spend so much time redoing Bob's work. And if I didn't fire Bob, the people who were best at the job were going to quit, all of them, because they were frustrated. They wanted to work in a place where they could do their best work, and Bob was getting in their way of that. And so I sat down with Bob to start a conversation that I should have begun, frankly, 10 months previously. And when I finished explaining to him where things stood, he pushed his chair back from the table. He looked at me in the eye and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question was going around in my head with no good answer, he looked at me again and he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realized that by not telling Bob, thinking I was being so nice, I'm having to fire him. Not so nice after all. It was such a terrible moment. It was bad for me. It was much worse for Bob because he was getting fired. It was bad for the whole team They were all frustrated, and it was bad for our investors because we weren't getting stuff done that we needed to get done. But it was too late to save Bob. Even Bob at this point thought he should go because his reputation on the team was just shot. All Bob could do in that moment, all I could do, in that moment was make myself a very solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again, and that I would do everything in my power to help other people avoid making that mistake, because it was terrible. It was bad for everybody.
Oh, this is a powerful story. And you're right, it does waken lots of thoughts in your own mind. The amount of times that my wife and I have looked at the kids and gone, we've probably fallen into ruinous empathy there with them, or maybe we were in a bit of the obnoxious there. And then maybe, oh God, you do it just by accident, like you say, and move across them sometimes to compensate for having been the other one for a while, or good cop, bad cop.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you hang out in ruinous empathy for a while and you get more and more and more frustrated, and then you explode, and you say the thing maybe in kind of the most obnoxious possible way because you're so mad. But it's like the other person doesn't understand why in the world you're so angry, because they were unaware all this time that they were doing something that was bothering you so much.
And, you mentioned earlier on, Myers-Briggs as well. So I do quite a bit of work with the color energies, and I kind of overlay it sometimes to go, you know what, you're right, this isn't about identification, because I remember you saying that in the book, because I listened to the Audible version, so I went, no, I'm not trying to map a color to a segment, that's not right. But what I do is, it's like you go, well, when you look at these just different personalities, if you're not a fan of color energies, just think of different personalities. So you know what does caring personally about them mean to them? What does that look like, sound like, and feel like? It's not the same for everybody. Some people it'll be, I know you're really busy, can I have 5 minutes? That's all they need to show that you care for them. Other people will need a whole lot more, and probably a load of groundwork, and maybe 2 or 3 of these conversations to even start to warm up to it.
Yeah. I think that the important thing, though, is that you don't have to necessarily have built a relationship with someone before you can start implementing radical candor. I often tell a story about meeting this man on the street of Manhattan. I had just gotten this puppy, and I loved the dog. I loved her so much. She was out of control. She's jumping all over the place. She jumped in front of a speeding cab. I pulled her out of the way in the nick of time. And I was standing on the street corner with my heart in my throat. And this man, a perfect stranger, looked at me and he said, I can tell you really love that dog. That was all he had to do to move up on the care personally dimension, was just notice my humanity in the moment. And he couldn't have done much more than that, because he didn't know me and I didn't know him. And then he said, but you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach her to sit. And he pointed at the ground with this kind of harsh gesture. And he said, sit. The dog sat. I had no idea she even knew what that meant. And I looked up at him in amazement, and he said, it's not mean, it's clear. And then the light changed, and he walked off with words, leaving me with words to live by. So I think that is an example of how radical candor can happen quickly, even with someone you don't know. You just need to take that extra beat to get aligned with the person, to show them that you're saying this thing because you notice that you don't have to have this deep, profound relationship with them, but you notice your shared humanity, and then you can point out the thing, because you understand what the person cares about. Like, I can tell you really love that dog. I can tell you really care about this project. I want to tell you something that'll help you succeed, So
connection first, isn't it? That human connection, we're in, and now we can exchange some other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Connect before content. And it's funny that kind of human connection, how important it is. And it really doesn't, we often use as an excuse for not doing it, I don't have time. But it saves time, that human connection. It saves a lot of time, because if it's important that the person hears you, then you have to establish that connection before they will hear you. I mean, I remember some of the best relationships I've formed in my career have started with, just asking someone about what they did on the weekend, or asking. There's one colleague of mine whose father had died, and I knew her father had died, and I just I said, I'm sorry, and I asked her about the funeral, and we talked about it for a couple of minutes, and that can create sort of so much warmth. Whereas it's tempting, if someone's parent has died, just not to talk about it because you don't know what to say. But push yourself to if you notice someone is dropping their papers all over the place, say, can I help? It doesn't take more than a minute, and it can have a really big impact.
Well, I think, you started off earlier by saying listening to understand. And I get it's a similar thing when I'm training people how to coach for the first time. And the panic is, well, what question am I going to ask next? I don't know. It's like, well, if you genuinely listen with that intent to understand deeply, you won't have to think of questions. They come. They will come. Don't you worry about it. The one came to me the other day, that the stories I love your stories, by the way. I'll call this guy Bob as well to keep him anonymous. Bob's getting a bad rep today. But he was having the similar trouble being candid, I guess, with, actually not being too candid. So probably going into the bottom right zone about some of the policies and procedures that are coming up at work, some of the vision statements. Oh, bless you.
Thank you.
And he got the feedback that he could come across a little bit too abrupt with these pieces of feedback sometimes. Yeah. But what was also true is that a lot of this stuff was built behind the scenes and then presented out, and they had loads of questions about it. And I just went, I almost like had your little walk into the room with a fly open in the back of my mind, because I thought, what really good in here, he'd got a young child. And I said, imagine like your daughter at preschool, and she'd spent all afternoon at preschool painting this picture of a flower for you. Yeah. And she's done it with her hands, and you look at it, and your first impression is, that is terrible. Like, what would you say? She said, well, I wouldn't say that. I said, wouldn't you? Why is that then? And immediately went to, well, I wouldn't want to hurt the feelings. I want to appreciate how long it took, and it was the effort that went into it. And I'd want to understand a little bit more about what it is and let them tell me and explain it to me. And maybe even we could go away and add more things to it together. Awesome. Why don't you do that with your bosses?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And you also want to just notice the love behind the work. And I think up, down, or sideways, we can notice that, or what's going on. Maybe somebody dashed something off in a moment because they've got a lot going on, and instead of saying, this was a sloppy, half-assed effort, say, it seems like you're in a hurry. What's going on before you jump into the
and it might be true. It might be a sloppy, half-assed effort. It might be, but starting it off like that's not going to win any friends.
Yeah. I think it's important to say, I know I know you're capable, for example, of great work. This is not your best work. What's going on, for example. So
I think that's a good moment to go on to another 2x2. We've got the new book now, which is officially a prequel.
Yes.
I love when you were saying that. How's that come about then? Why did you feel there needed to be that prequel to it?
Yeah, well, if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed I did. And it was some feedback I got about radical candor that caused me to sit down and write Radical Respect. I was giving a radical candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco, and I was really excited to give this talk because the CEO of that company had been a colleague for the better part of a decade of mine, and she's a person I like and respect enormously, and she's also one of too few Black women CEOs in tech or in any other sector. And when I finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside And she said to me, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you to roll it out. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer people even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true, and I knew how unfair it was. And because she's one of the most cheerful, even-keeled people I've ever met. And it made me realize when she told me this, 4 things at the same time. The first is that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had never intervened. I had noticed this or maybe I hadn't noticed it happening, and I should have noticed it happening. And I had never taken into account the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting, and the toll that must take on her, because she had what to be pissed off about, as we all do at work from time to time. But unlike me, she was not allowed to say it. So that was number one. I'd failed to be an upstander. The second thing I realized was that not only was I in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her in the workplace, I was also in denial about the kinds of things that was happening to me in the workplace. I also had been the target of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. But I had gone through my whole career kind of pretending that a whole bunch of things were not happening that were in fact happening. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit. But I never really wanted to think of myself as a victim, so I just ignored a bunch of stuff. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I ever want to think of myself as a culprit. So the third thing that I realized was that I was most deeply in denial about the times when I was the one whose disrespect made it harder than it needed to be for my colleagues to get their job done. And that is, I think, for me at least, that's the hardest of all the different roles and all the different things that I realized. But there was another realization, was that as a leader, I thought of myself as this person who's creating these BS-free zones where everybody does the best work of their lives and builds the best relationships of their careers. But by pretending that disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not happening on my team, I was unable to prevent them from getting in the way of our ability to collaborate. As my son's baseball coach says, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong. And I was pretending that things were not going wrong, that were in fact going wrong. And so that prompted me to sit down and to think about what are the elements of a respectful work environment. And you know me, I love a good 2x2. So you want to optimize for collaboration and honor everyone's individuality at the same time. We all want to work on teams and to build teams where the strength of the team is the individual and the strength of the individual is enhanced by the team, where you get the best of both worlds of individuality in a team. And so what could possibly get in the way of that, since that's what we all want? And I think the answer is a million things, but I'm going to boil it down to 3 big ones: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think one of the problems here is that we often conflate bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they're the same thing, but they're actually 3 very different things. And when we conflate 3 different problems as one problem, the problem can start to feel monolithic and insoluble. So let's break the problem down in order to solve it. Bias is not meaning it. Unconscious bias is really what I mean there. Prejudice, on the other hand, is meaning it. It's a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying is not about a belief, conscious or unconscious. It's just about being mean. And for me, that was very helpful to begin to break the problem down and to figure out what we can do about these problems, both as upstanders, as people who are harmed by bias, prejudice, and bullying, as people who sometimes exhibit bias, prejudice, and bullying, which unfortunately we're all bound to do, and as leaders.
I love it. When I was watching a video of you talking about it, and I think it's quite refreshing to kind of go, well, you know what, we've got something out there like Radical Candor that is really, really clear. And as with all these things in the world, these lovely, simple frameworks, there's always reasons why in certain places or for certain people, they don't quite hit the mark or they're not quite going to work. For example, you mentioned about your colleague before. And it's great to see the author's gone, okay, Well, let's look at that then.
Yeah.
What's getting in the way of that
Yeah.
that I can make it even more relevant?
Yeah.
Bring it back again, that human level, that these opinions, these biases, these prejudices, and the bullying, because it
Yeah.
does happen more commonly than we like to believe sometimes, I think. Solving that and becoming more radically respectful will enable us all to have
To
more
be more
radical
radical.
candor.
Yeah. And I think enable us all is really important. When my father read Radical Candor, he tried to tell me this before that. And I didn't listen to him the way I should have. But he said, he's a white man. So he's having a different experience than my colleague who's a black woman, but still a different version of the same problem. Because he said, when I say what I think, people are prone to call me an asshole. and he's not an asshole, my father. He was, but he was often misinterpreted, so he had to learn how to adjust the way he was talking, but also he had to acknowledge that this was a bias he was confronted with. And, and I think the other thing that is hard about radical respect is I talked about these 4 different roles as though they're totally separate, but often we're in several different roles at the same time. So here's a story about a time when I was sort of all 3 of the roles anyway. I was a leader, I was an upstander, but I thought of myself as the person harmed, as the target of and that was a problem because I needed to optimize for my role as leader. So I had just hired this guy, and he tended to talk about the women on his team. He referred to them as girls. And for me, this is like fingers on a chalkboard because it's like the wrong answer on an SAT. Man is to woman as boy is to girl. So but I didn't say anything to him because I'm also sick of having this conversation. In fact, there were 2 other men on my team who had worked for me at a previous company. And I had already long conversations with them, kind of a big fight with them, and finally convinced them that they needed to refer to women as women and not as girls. And so I'm sick of this conversation. And I'm thinking that I'm, the target of the bias as opposed to the leader. And so I decided not to say anything to him. And he had been at the company for about a month. And my boss scheduled a meeting with him. And my boss was Sheryl Sandberg. And he walked into Sheryl Sandberg's office and talked about the girls on his team. And unlike me, she did not hold back. She was very radically candid about why this was a problem. And so he felt like the meeting did not go well. And he came into my office, and I was sitting with these other 2 guys with whom I'd already had the argument. And he told us what had happened. And he said, it was another Bob that he said to me, "Why didn't you tell me?" And instead of admitting to him that I had failed him as his leader, I was still in the mindset of, I'm a woman. I don't like being called a girl. I'm the victim here. And I looked at these other 2 guys on my team and I said, "You can thank me now for telling you not to do it." And this new guy on the team was like, "Well, why didn't you tell me? Thanks a lot, Kim." And that was when I realized, in this case, I was the leader and I needed to act like the leader. And it was my job to have told him. I was also I also failed as an upstander. I also should have intervened for the sake of all the women on his team who probably also didn't like getting called girls. So for his sake, for their sake, and also for my boss's sake, so she didn't have to have the conversation. I sort of failed everybody.
What's also true is you mentioned your energy for having that conversation had probably dwindled over the years because you'd had it so many times.
Yeah. You get sick of it, but at a certain point, you've got to keep these are deeply ingrained habits of speech for people. There was another CEO who I worked with who tended to get up in front of his whole company and say, "Hey guys." And at the same time, the CEO was really trying to address a gender imbalance problem at the company. And so I said to him, this is not really helping. talking, because not everyone is a guy. But I'm from the South, so it's easy for me to say, hey, y'all, but that did not fall trippingly off his tongue. These deeply ingrained patterns of speech that reflect bias and reinforce bias are worth changing because words matter, but it's also important to recognize that it's hard to change. This CEO had to buy a bunch of styrofoam rockets on rubber bands and invite people to shoot them at him when he said, hey, but also like making a little bit light of this. I think we've gotten to a point where we've created so much heaviness around these topics. And there's a reason for that. I mean, sometimes people are traumatized. But there are also times when we can be light about it, and I think we should.
100%. Well, I love it in your radical respect when you talk about collaborate. That's what that is. Help me achieve this. Let's do this together. And I think the opposite of those really rung true for me when you talk about you can coerce people rather than collaborate, and sometimes we might demand conformity. There's always this red flag I hear from leaders when I coach them, and it tends to be something along the lines of, why aren't they doing what I've asked them to do, or do what I've told them to do? Why aren't they doing it in the way that I've told them to do it? That sort of thing. It's like, well, why should they? Yeah. What have you? Why do they have to do it as you've said? And it just goes to show, that you're not respecting that individuality, and you're not fostering a culture of collaboration. So thinking you're going to get a feedback culture or a great radical candor culture out the back of it.
Yeah. Telling people what to do doesn't work. It just doesn't. I
will vouch for that in terms of both of my teenage kids and my dog as well. None of them do what they're told to do.
Bill Clinton once said that being president of a country is a lot like being the overseer of a cemetery. There's a lot of people under you, but nobody's listening. and he had a lot of power, and he felt that way. So I think it's even more true if you're managing a team that
Love that.
People are not necessarily listening.
Definitely feels like that in my house.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
You gotta give them a reason to listen, and the first reason you give them is to start by listening to them, by soliciting feedback.
Love it. I've really enjoyed that conversation, Kim. I wish we could go on for another 50 minutes or so. It's great to talk to you. I guess we've got to the end of the show, and as I like to do at the end of the show is kind of look back and go, what have we talked about? Not many surprises, probably, considering the books you've written and why I asked you on. But what would be a great name for the show? Any ideas from yourself before I jump in with what I've written down?
Yeah, I would call this show the Radical Show.
The Radical Show.
Let's get radical.
Let's get radical.
Let's get radical. Let's call it.
I've got this vision of Olivia Newton-John singing in the background now. Radical. I love that. There will be no promo videos of me singing in a leotard.
I think that's a good plan.
Brilliant. Let's get radical. I absolutely love that. And if people want to follow you and know more about your work, where's best to follow you, Kim?
So there's a Radical Candor podcast where we talk about both radical candor and radical respect. You can also check out radicalcandor.com, where we tell you all the different things. There's a sitcom that we've made. There's a Learn from the Expert class that we've made. We do talks and workshops. We're building a fake Kim Scott, FAIK Kim Scott, who will scale. Unlike me, I need to sleep. Fake Kim Scott does not need to sleep. So check out radicalcandor.com and definitely buy a copy of Radical Respect, the new book. Would love to get and send feedback.
Can they get the book through the website?
They can get the book through the website. They can get it at their favorite independent bookstore, on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever you like to buy books. Radical Respect will be there. And
Audible version out soon or already?
It's out.
Oh,
I read Radical Candor, and I got a lot of feedback that people hate the sound of my voice. So yes, hate the sound of my voice. So we hired a professional to read the second edition of Radical Candor and also Radical Respect.
Right. And no plans to read it yourself then?
I mean, the feedback was pretty unequivocal that a lot of people hate the
Really?
sound of my voice. So I listened to the feedback and hired an expert reader.
And no doubt now you'll get feedback. Oh, it's a shame you're not reading.
Why didn't you? Yes, that's true. Maybe I over-indexed on the feedback.
There you go. We could always anniversary edition. Always do the second as well.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. I will put, for those listening, I'll put links to the books, to the website, to the podcast. I will put all of those on there on the show notes. So it's just a click away for people. And absolutely, please either go out there and listen to it or read the new book. And also with Radical Candor, if you've not done so already, I listened to it on Spotify because I know that they've launched them all on there as well. So it's loads of places.
I will say though, on Spotify, listen to the whole damn book, because if you listen to half of it, I only get paid half of my royalty. So I'm not a fan of the Spotify business model.
There you go. Noted.
Yeah, I wrote a whole op-ed about it.
If for any reason you don't get through the whole book on Spotify, at least let it run.
Yes, please.
Noted. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much for that today, Kim. Really enjoyed the episode. Let's get radical is what we'll call it. It's awesome. Pleasure to speak to you.
Great to speak to you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Have a great day.
Be well. Bye.
That's it for this episode of the Leadership Untitled podcast. This episode will be called Let's Get Radical, named after the two books, Radical Candor and Radical Respect, that Kim has written. Please join me in thanking Kim for a fantastic conversation, as well as lots of insights and advice and stories. And also my thanks go out to you, the listener, for listening into this episode. So please, if you haven't done so already, subscribe, like, follow the series wherever it is you get your podcasts on that streaming service so you don't miss future and past episodes. Have a great day.